Good evening. I'm Glenn Longabaugh. I'm a regional agronomist for WinField. I think most of you know me. I've been around for several years. The topic today is a systematic approach to plant nutrition, right? Can you guys all hear me okay? Good, good, good. I'd rather not wear the headset mess. As long as Peter can hear me back there, it's all good. Right. So before we start, are there any burning questions around plant nutrition, right? And do I need to collect pocket knives after the previous session inside here? Yeah. I was back here sawing away on my wrist, you know. I got to tell you, those guys, they accuse me of being long-winded, but I want to tell you, a guy from Southern Indiana can boil this down a lot quicker than the guys from Minnesota. You know, the poorest farmers and the poorest ground always have a way to get together. Isn't that what you always heard? I think that's what he was trying to say. Ultimately, you guys have any questions about plant nutrition before I start? Because I'm going to go through this pretty quick. I've only got 20 minutes. If not, let's talk about nutrient removal by crop, right? So, you know, when times get tough, which we're obviously in, right? The previous speaker over there was talking about how tough times are, and he wasn't very optimistic for the future. But, you know, I know a little bit about how growers, you know, I know a little bit about their psychology, and I understand where they try to cut costs, right? And hopefully what you took away is it's not your cost per acre, it's your cost per bushel. But there are some costs that are absolutely fixed, right? So hopefully you took away that when you go to buy seed, right, regardless of whether you buy the cheapest seed or the best seed, you know what, you're probably going to have 80 to 110 bucks, right? When you go to buy nitrogen, right, if you are the best shopper in the world, you're huge, you put it all on yourself, you're probably still going to have somewhere between 80 and 100 unit, or 80 to $100, right? It's going to approach 50 cents a unit, or maybe exceed 50 cents a unit. If you take crop protection products, right? Crop protection is going to run you somewhere in that $50 range, right? On corn or soybeans, either one. Soybeans might exceed $50. You know, some of you are better purchasers than others. We talk about P&K fertilizer, right? If you're on really good ground and you've already got great big numbers and you can use only maintenance amounts, guess what? That's a cost that those guys on the really good ground don't have to contend against, right? It actually costs more to raise crops on more common ground because you typically start out with lower values. So typically you have to use more P&K, right? If we look at the removal, this is not uptake, this is removal on 180 bushel corn, you're looking at 64 pounds of P2O5, right? And so what is 68 pounds of P2O5? What does that equate to? Well, it's about 150 pounds of DAP. Right? You're only looking at about 49 pounds of K2O. And so if you look at potash, that's a little less than 100 pounds of potash. Right? These are the amount. I don't care what kind of foo-foo juice or pixie dust you put on the ground. When you remove a 180 bushel crop or a 200 bushel crop, you're going to remove mineral nutrition that cannot be replaced by a microbe. Right? You might loosen some up that's already there. But ultimately, we are physically removing mineral nutrition from the soil. So when you think about that as a grower, right, there is some cost that you absolutely have to have. And the reason why I bring this up is, I don't care how you slice it, you know, if you're using maintenance amounts, it's probably somewhere, and you're raising 180 bushel corn, you know, you're probably looking at $65 to $70 an acre. If you're building that ground up, right, I love how he wants you to give up your common ground. Well, that's fine if you haven't been farming that for some period of time and you've got sweat equity, right? Dale spent a shit pot load of money, right? That's a technical term, trying to build up the nutrition, right? Maybe you've been working on weed control, right? It's a little easier to talk about giving up common ground whenever you don't have any skin in that game, right? If you've already made the investment, it's much more difficult. So I don't want to play that down, but these are absolute costs that you have to, that you're going to have to, you know, you're going to have to find a way to cover. You know, if you add these up, you know, bankers call those variable costs. They're really not variable at all, right? If you're spending 100 on nitrogen and you're spending you know, somewhere 70 to 100 on P&K, you're spending 50 on crop protection, you know, you start adding these up, I dare you to put out a corn crop for less than about 400 bucks an acre. And so that's like playing Texas Hold'em, right? You're going to get a whole handful of cards over the course of the game, but you make the biggest bet before you ever see the first card, right? That's what you're doing as farmers. And so let's talk about, you know, why it is and how we make this decision as to how much we put down. Because I've already told you can't do without any, but ultimately we need to be smart. We need to think about, you know, strategies to make the most for our dollar. I need you to know, I need you to understand, that there is a reason why common ground often costs more to farm. And that is, most of you don't want to raise 180 bushel corn or 60 bushel corn. You want to raise, 250 bushel corn, right? You always are wanting to stretch, right? That's when we make a windfall, is when we reduce those costs per bushel. And yet you need to know that to raise 250 or 300 bushel corn, which you've all done, right? In the 2 previous years, especially 2 years ago, most of you had plenty of places in your field where you're raising 300 bushel corn. Do you understand how much mineral nutrition was taken up in that crop? I'm not talking about removed, but I'm talking about taken up, right? To do that much carbon fixation, right? To do that amount of photosynthesis, you have to take up an incredible amount of mineral nutrition. So on 300 bushel corn, right, you're looking at 192 pounds of P2O5, 366 pounds of K2O is taken up. And so when you guys see a soil test that says medium or low, your likelihood is you're going to get a pretty high response. Your likelihood of going out there with a maintenance level of P and K and raising 300 bushel corn is not very high at all, right? And so there's a reason why traditionally the best farms have been richer in P and K. They've been richer in fertility. And it's because those that reinvest tend to have better crops overall. Some of you fertilize. I think this group is really good, right? I cover a pretty wide swath, and there's areas in the world where they fertilize corn heavily and they don't fertilize soybeans, right? You've seen the analogy where, corn gets the full meal deal and soybeans get the leftovers. Well, look at the nutritional uptake of 100 bushel soybeans, right? 430 pounds of K. I'm not saying you have to supplement 733 pounds of potash. I'm saying that if you don't have decent levels, right, it is highly unlikely that you'll ever see maximum yields, right? So it doesn't show up immediately, and I'll show you that here in a minute. But over time, if you negate or you neglect mineral nutrition, it will bite you, right? Here's an example. If you get up here in the high, very high, what's your response to making a mineral amendment of potassium or potash? Young lady, what's your response up here when you get really good soil test ratings? You think it's good?
I have no idea.
I don't know. If I'm down here at less than 1% of the time, I'm going to see a probability of increase. I don't think that's a very good, to me, I'm thinking, well, gee, why am I even putting it on? Well, the reason why you put it on is because you don't want to fall up into here, right? So does that make sense? So ultimately, if you're down here, you may get by without putting on P and K for a year, and you're like, well, gee, I think that guy over at WinField is on glue. I think he's been in a closed space putting up wallpaper or something. No, it's because initially it doesn't show up. But I'm telling you, by the time you get far enough down the road that you get down in these levels, then you can't afford to put it back, right? It's easy to build it over time. It's difficult to build it rapidly. And by the time you start to see the symptoms of poor mineral nutrition, then you're already in trouble, right? This is the normal fertilizer recommendation scheme, right? So if we have really low levels, this would be your soil test level across the bottom, right? If we're over to the left-hand side, typically you can't get it by with just maintenance amounts, right? It's not just about putting down what is removed because you have really low levels to begin with. What do we know? Well, we know the uptake is way higher than maintenance. So if you're over there on low soil test, you have to put on more, right? You have to do some building up. Otherwise, there's just not enough native fertility in the soil. Likewise, you get over here on the other end of the range, right? And you'll hear an economist or you'll hear an agronomist talk about drawing down. It's pretty tough. Nick, if you've got P tests of 70 or 80 and you got K tests of 400, 450, you probably worked at getting them there, right? And I probably would not, I'd probably use maintenance amounts, but I probably wouldn't work a lot on drawdown. Now, if we're talking about a contest winner that has K levels of 3,000, and a contest winner that has P levels of 1,200, right? That's a different scenario, right? Those kind of levels, if it didn't have a crop growing on it, there would be some kind of hazardous waste site, right? And there's some of that around, but in that case, maybe we ought to be looking at drawing some down. But for most of this group, right, excepting those fields that are right next to the turkey barn or right next to the hog barn, right, most of those fields, that's not what we're flirting with. So if economics are tight, what is your strategy, right? There's several strategies, right? We could just do a flat rate based on our budget, right? We all have a banker. and the banker says, in some cases that's just our bride, but the banker says, you know what, I saw that Superior Ag bill, you're not going to spend any more next year than this, right? And you could make that, Glenn, and that might be an okay strategy. But I think there's probably better ways than making flat rate applications and just giving the whole farm a smattering, right? You could make flat rate by maintenance off the field averages. In other words, those fields, Mark, that have really good averages where you're removing a lot of groceries, you put more back there. And those fields that maybe didn't yield so well because they were flooded out and you know that there wasn't a lot of mineral nutrition lost, maybe those are fields that you back off. That's a strategy, and there's nothing wrong with that either. You could use variable rate by soil type, right? You could go in and look at soil types and say, you know what, those Evansville silt loams, it's very similar to the one right above it. You say, man, those Evansville silt loams, man, that's where I pull all the yield off, right? And the Alford and the Hosmer and the Stendals, right? Maybe I'll pull it back just a hair there. That's another strategy. You could do variable rate by some kind of production maintenance. In other words, within the same field, you actually look at the real-time data, and you can get that data from your yield monitor, and you can have somebody from Superior Ag make a SAMS map to make applications based on what the yield was for that particular spot. Or if you don't have combine data, you could use R2-7, right? They actually have technology where they've got NDVI images that have been taken through the summer. They can look at your basically the amount of biomass that's on that acre, and with pretty good precision, write a prescription for variable rate based on what your crop was. And then the last way is variable rate by grid sampling, right? And most of you have probably been exposed to some kind of grid sampling over time, right? And this is where we go out and we take them on some relatively small grid, and we try to extrapolate that across whatever the 2.5 or 5 acre grid is. So here would be flat rate to the left. Here would be variable rate by soil type on the right. This was the state of the art in the 20th century, but now we're in the 21st century. So you go to 21st century, here's yield monitor data. And you could potentially have somebody with Superior Ag go in and mark this area, or those of you that are actually recording with cab view, you can highlight this area, and it will actually make a SAMS map for you, right? And basically you can make applications based on where the yield was. So these green areas would get a higher application rate. These red areas, this looks like a wasp cob to me. This red area right here is probably a place that got flooded out, right? Do we really need to put a bunch of fertilized gene where we've got flooded out? Probably not, right? So this is a really good strategy. But there's maybe a better strategy for those that haven't spent a lot of time getting it evened up, or maybe if you have a piece of ground that you're not sure about, maybe the best option is to think about using grid sampling, right? Here's an example of a pretty good sized farm. This is about 80 acres, and yet you can see that when it comes to potassium, it's not very evenly distributed across this farm at all, right? There's 1/4 down here that really requires a lot of potassium. If you look closely, of this farm, of this 82 acres, really only about 42 acres of it really requires any kind of potassium amendment, right? And this is getting it up to a critical level of 300 pounds per acre, right? And actually, if we made this prescription, it would only be about 80 pounds of potash per acre. So here's a way that you could potentially go in, prop the field up, right? It's not about using more or even using less. It's about using the same or maybe a hair less, but using it more effectively, right? That's the beauty of soil sampling and using this strategy going forward. This is a way I think you could maybe do a better job making ends meet. So let's talk about in-season production on corn, right? I know we're pretty long in the tooth on this corn crop, but there are some late planted corn out there that could still potentially stand some amendments, right? This is a really, since he's in the audience, I'm going to tell you this is a really handsome, really smart grower, right? This is Todd Meyer's farm, and this particular, do what? Yeah, well, I did qualify that I knew you were present. So anyway, you'll notice this is a V4 sampling. What do we know about V4 corn? Is V4 corn, has it been out there growing for a long period of time? Is it totally and completely independent, or has it been for much of its life? Not at all, right? V4 corn has just basically quit nursing, right? It's been living off the seed until probably the previous leaf stage, and now it is just starting to live off the nodal roots. And so this is an example from Todd's farm where they took tissue samples. By the way, I need you to know that Superior Ag is one of the leaders in tissue sampling in the Midwest, right? They've taken over 500 samples themselves this year. That's a lot of sampling, right? It's a very time and labor intensive job collecting tissue samples. But the data that you gain from tissue samples is really, really valuable. So here is a V4 sample. Todd came in, made a side dress application to part of the field and left some of the field untreated, and then they basically sampled that field, Robert, as they went through the season. So what you see is, you know, in the left-hand side, you have the V6 samples, both top-dressed and untreated. In the middle, you have the V10 samples, top-dressed and untreated. On the right, you have the R1 sample. And R1 is, that's when we basically have silks exerting, right? This is the first reproductive stage. So at this point, all vegetative growth has stopped when we get over here to R1. And anyway, I just think it's interesting. So when they made this top dress application here just about 3 days before V6, you can see that in a relatively short period of time, they already had propped up boron to some extent, right? Now that's unusual. Normally we take a week or sometimes even 2 weeks to see the physiological benefits, but if we're talking about in-season amendments, right? I've already told you that we're looking at probably $400 invested before you ever see a card in this Texas Hold'em game, right? Right? Does that seem really smart? Wouldn't it be better to maybe ante up 380 or 350, and then as you start to see the cards, like getting a tissue sample, right, you get some competitive intelligence, you got some kind of idea what kind of hand you're going to end up with, that you suddenly make amendments, you start raising the bet based on what kind of crop you've got, right? And you don't just willy-nilly say, oh, well, we're going to add ZMB, or oh, we're going to put gradual in, or you actually use some competitive intelligence to try to fix the problem. If you go up to V10, you're probably saying, well, boy, that doesn't look very good for a spider graph, man. There's a lot of area not covered on the curve. That is absolutely true. But there's a lot more area covered on the one that has been top dressed, right, where they use K-mag and urea and some boron, right, than what there is in the bottom. So once we start getting short, you realize that when we get to V10, we are in the middle of grand growth, right? So when we get in grand growth, our uptake of nitrogen, potassium just absolutely becomes exponential, right? We're putting a lot of pressure on that plant. And so our tissue samples almost always wane for two reasons. One, plants have a hard time taking up enough of these mineral nutrients. And two, the plant is growing so rapidly, right? Sometimes this is actually a good sign to see this. The more pressure, the more grand the growth, right? The more leaves you put on and the more rapidly you do it, guess what? The more pressure you put on the tissue samples, right? So often when we get in grand growth, the tissue sample and the growth are indirectly proportional. Bigger the growth, the poorer the sample. But look at the difference between the one that wasn't top dressed and the one that was. Now move over to R1, right? When you look at the R1 sample, you'll notice it looks significantly better. In fact, the only thing we're probably short on is just magnesium. Where we get in the one at the bottom, we're short on some micronutrients also. Now the takeaway here is, right, when we get to R1, we're now flowering. We're halfway through that plant's life cycle, right? We still have a full 60, 65 days. Did you know that fully 30% or more of the nitrogen is still yet to be taken up? Even without any new leaves, without any more growth, right? Plant does relax a little bit, normally gets a little richer in mineral nutrients because it stopped growing vegetatively, but that factory is still running full bore. It still needs a lot of those critical mineral nutrients that it needed during grand growth, right? And so you can see what better shape the field that was top dressed with some micros in it was over the one that was untreated. So what are some of the products we use? You know, in 20 minutes, we can't cover all the products, but this is where the folks from Superior Ag will put you in the right products. One, they've done a lot of tissue sampling, and two, they make a lot of topical amendments with with nutritionals. Do we want to try to fix nitrogen? Do we want to try to fix potassium or phosphorus over the top late in the season? No, right? Those are macronutrients. But often we use macronutrients like the Gainer products along with Max-In ZMB or Max-In Ultramanganese or Max-In Boron to try to fill some of those temporal deficiencies. How about soybeans, right? If we look at soybeans R1, we're a little past that, right? On small beans, it's around potassium, manganese, copper, phosphorus, right? R2, we've got some late planted beans that are still in R2. It's potassium, copper, phosphorus. Do you notice that there's one that always comes up at the top? Right, it's around potassium. What was the uptake on 100 bushel soybeans? It was 433 pounds is the total uptake. That's why you see it often show up as the most limited, deficient, or responsive sample that we get is potassium. But that's a hard one to fix in season, right? We get to R3, still potassium, copper, manganese, sulfur. R4, this is where a lot of our better soybeans are at right now. And if you have not made a fungicide application, there is still an opportunity here to put more bushels in our soybeans. And especially if they're good looking beans, I would think about making an amendment. Maybe use some Max-In sulfur to fix the Max-In sulfur, or mix the sulfur, fix the sulfur, and potentially fix the potassium, because there's a little bit of potassium in Max-In sulfur. Or maybe use High K. Those would be a great product. Here's just some of the products that we use. The last thing I want to leave you with, because I'm already out of time, I got a little too carried away, is around elemental prominence. Right? When we talk about corn, it is important to note that just because something is taking up at a particular time doesn't necessarily mean that that's when we see the biggest response. Zinc, for example, most of it's taken up late, and yet when we see the biggest response is early. Magnesium, on the other hand, in corn, it's all about late in the season, right? And this is actually the micros, not the secondaries. When we talk about soybeans, it's very much different, right? Any time we're short in reproduction, you can see a response. So if you're short on magnesium, don't be afraid to add magnesium, right? Any questions before I run you guys off? Because 20 minutes is all I got. Todd, you got any questions?
Good.
Did I represent your farm fairly?
I think so.
Good. Did you have a question?
Yeah, that top dress, when you was talking about that corn, he top dressed each time, or
No,
just one
that-
time, and
he
that's
top-
how it
That's
was
right.
the difference?
That's right. He made a top dress application. Did you make any ZMB or any other micro applications on that farm?
So we sprayed, actually the weeds had been burned down for a long time, so we made the initial post-application of herbicide before that V4 tissue test. So that had ZMB in it.
There you go.
Before it was tissue tested.
There you go. Yeah, I suspected on those later ones, as good as the zinc and manganese was, that on the treated, that it probably had.
Yeah, so the side dress had zinc and boron in it as well.
There you go.
Zinc
Very good.
LS.
Great question. Any other questions before we run you off? Because I'm over and they've already threatened me.
Well, actually,
Yeah.
Feeding the crop what it needs and not wasting money.
Absolutely. You can do it as liquid. Personally, some of you are my neighbors, that I hobby farm a little bit. And personally, I've got a side dress machine. So I use liquid and I add liquid 10% boron and I add ATS, right? Not necessarily WinField products. ATS is just a commodity, but I add that in there. I don't add it in there because it's cheap. I add it in there because sulfur is often limiting to our crops. Right? Last year, you all saw where Sean Castile made like the super secret sauce to soybeans was what? Sean Castile, he's your Purdue soybean plant physiologist. Well, in 2017, he was up at La Crosse where he had lots and lots of rain. And guess what? You have lots and lots of rain, the anions tend to get short. Why is that? It's because they're not tied to the soil, right? The soil is negatively charged. These anions, things like nitrates, sulfates, borates, right? They are really, really soluble, and so they leach out of the soil profile. And on those wet years, that's when you see problems with sulfur deficiency. And just so happened that particular site, it was a huge advantage to have sulfur. So where they supplemented sulfur is like 12 bushels better. I don't care if soybeans are $8 a bushel, right? 12 bushel advantage, man, that pays for a lot of groceries. So I think it's in our interest as growers, before we abandon a farm, maybe we need to think about managing this a little more intensely. I loved the first speaker's thought that, we were visiting outside And he said, you know, before you think about taking on more ground, you know, you need to make sure everything you got's tiled or irrigated, right? Maybe that's the first dollar you spend. And you know, you guys all know that that's not necessarily applicable, but tile is pretty important.